Hello everybody, this is Conquering History Games and welcome to the channel and welcome back if you've been here before. Before I wanted to start this Kaiserreich lore video, I just wanted to talk about a couple of things. First off, I know a lot of people wanted me to do an April Fool's Day video. I didn't do it because I was busy working on this. It was a very busy weekend and I figured that you guys would appreciate a Kaiserreich lore video that you can enjoy all year round, much more than some sort of prank video that's going to be old after a day. But on that note, as I said, as many of you know, I do work full-time. This is strictly a hobby of mine. I do make some small bit of money from ad revenue and things like that, and of course I have my Patreons, but it's certainly not enough that I could do this as a full-time job. It is strictly a hobby. On that note, I really enjoy making these kinds of videos, even though they are much more labor-intensive than my gameplay videos, and typically will have less views overall than a campaign series. But I really like to make them. So I wanted to just run a little experiment on today's video. I have deliberately demonetized this video, and if you enjoy it, I would ask that you show your support by going to my Patreon link below, patreon.com/conqueringhistory. And if every single person who watched this video, or even a fraction of them, were to pledge a single $1 a month to the Patreon, showing me that you support the work that I do, I could afford to maybe, if not quit my real job, but even go part-time, allowing me more time to make these sorts of videos, which take hours of writing and research and editing to do. So that's just my Patreon pitch. You don't have to if you don't want to. Don't dip into your rent money for this. Anyway, I hope you all enjoy today's Kaiserreich lore video. Oh yeah, and subscribe if you haven't already. As the United States was entering 1936, its society was divided like it had never been before. The country found itself fractured along increasingly different ideological lines. The 20th century had started prosperously, and many had already begun to call it the American century. The United States had been spared the horrors of the Weltkrieg, and as the years rolled on, the good times seemed as if they were never going to end. However, a Great Depression rocked the country in 1925, and for over a decade the Depression would cripple America's economy, feeding the popularity of left-wing organizations such as the IWW and the Combined Syndicates of America. This growth was accelerated as year after year the Depression dragged on, and neither Republican nor Democratic administrations appeared to be able to stop it. The socialist parties would grow popular enough to split the presidential vote in 1932, forcing the presidency to be chosen by the House of Representatives. With a Republican majority in the House, the unpopular President Hoover was re-elected. This controversial election would not only fracture the country politically, but it would give rise to a new party led by the captivating Senator of Louisiana, Huey Long. And as the 1936 election approached, each party's frontrunners were becoming clear. Huey Long had formed his own party, the American First Union Party, and was obviously going to be its first nominee for president. The Combined Syndicates of America were likely going to nominate Alexander Berkman. However, due to his illness, John Reed's name had been in the discussion as a replacement. The Democrats had chosen social liberal from Texas, John Nance Gardner, whose main appeal was that he wasn't a Republican. And the Republican Party had nominated Hoover's own vice president, Charles Curtis. For many voters, there was little difference between Curtis and Hoover or any of the other nominees devoid of charisma that the Republican Party had nominated since the days of Theodore Roosevelt. Curtis was 76 years old, and his health was in decline. It was used as both compliment and insult that Curtis was a stand-patter who was the most regular of Republicans and merely filled the role of being the most inoffensive person possible. However, to those who knew Charles in his past, he was a much more complex and colored man than he might first appear. Charles Curtis was a man who spent half his life torn between separate worlds. He was born into conflict in the year 1860 in the state of Kansas, which had been suffering from years of violent confrontations over the legality of slavery. His formative years would take place during the American Civil War, in which his own father would serve and become imprisoned during. His father had been a pioneer of English descent and married a woman who was part French and Indian. Through his mother, he was a member of the Kaw or Kansa tribe, which his home state was named after. Through his mother, he was descended from the Kaw chief White Plume, who in the early 19th century saw that his tribe could only be saved through accommodation with the United States. In 1825, as part of his cooperation policy with the United States, in the Treaty of St. Louis, White Plum sold the government 18 million acres of land in exchange for 20 years of cash payments, livestock, and assistance from the United States to help transition the Kaw from a hunting to an agricultural society. This also established a Kaw reservation in southern Kansas. Curtis's mother died when he was only 3 years old, and he spent his childhood living on the Kaw Indian Reservation of Council Grove with his maternal grandmother, Julie Pipin. It was here he would stay until he was 13 years old, during which time he learned the Kaw language before he knew English. As a young man, he was witness to a Cheyenne invasion of the Kaw reservation. After this attack, he accompanied his uncle to Topeka to ask assistance and protection from the governor. Later in life, Curtis would say that this was the moment he chose to live in the white man's world. In 1873, the Kaw were forced to resettle in Oklahoma, and Curtis's grandmother told him to go live with his paternal grandparents despite his objections. She did so he can finish his education and have a better life than he would be afforded on an Indian reservation. Curtis would spend the rest of his youth in Topeka, Kansas, holding various jobs, including being a jockey before becoming a clerk and then a partner of local attorney A.H. Case. By 1884, Curtis was elected as county prosecutor, where he campaigned on the phrase, "If you don't want the law enforced, then don't vote for me." In the same year, he married Anne Baird, with whom he would have 3 children. After several years of county service, he ran for Congress, and despite running against the member of the locally powerful Populist Party, was successfully elected into the House of Representatives in 1892. He would act as representative for 8 consecutive terms and served on several important committees during this time. Notably, he introduced what would become known as the Curtis Act, which was meant to further integrate the native tribes into the United States, which he saw as best for their future. Unfortunately, revisions to the bill in the House and Senate made Curtis very unhappy with the final bill. In 1907, Curtis would be elected to the U.S. Senate, where he served for almost 20 years. It was during his time in the Senate that he became the first senator to introduce the Equal Rights Amendment to the United States Constitution, which would have stated that men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States and every place subject to its jurisdiction. In 1928, Curtis would vacate his Senate seat to run for the presidency. Though his bid was unsuccessful, he was picked as Herbert Hoover's vice presidential nominee. He was successfully elected in 1928 and again in 1932 by the House of Representatives. These decades of public service were finally brought to a head with the Republican Party nominating Curtis for the presidency of the United States. This was controversial for many due to Curtis being so closely tied to the Hoover administration. However, Curtis was never really close to Hoover. His counsel was rarely sought in legislative matters, was rarely in cabinet meetings, and there were Republicans who had not even wanted Curtis to remain on Hoover's ticket when he had run for re-election in 1932. Partly in an effort to balance the ticket, Curtis picked as his vice presidential nominee a younger man with the most famous last name in America. Quentin Roosevelt was the youngest son of the late Theodore Roosevelt. Though young, he had become the spearhead of the progressive branch of the Republican Party who wanted to reform the party from within. His nomination as the vice presidential nominee was Curtis's choice, though at least in part to prevent further splitting of the Republican vote when November came. Quentin brought to the campaign platform his Fair Deal plan. It was conceived as the spiritual successor to his father's Square Deal plan. However, it promised to be even more comprehensive, with programs aimed at not only broader relief for workers and farmers, but even more radical measures such as Social Security pensions for the elderly and public works programs to simultaneously lower unemployment and improve the nation's infrastructure. Due to the four-way split in the voting, the Curtis Roosevelt ticket would prove successful in the 1936 election. However, winning the election was not the end of the struggle to end the political crisis that was gripping the country. There were still angered forces in the country, voices shouting that the election had not been legitimate, and the potential for a military coup loomed dangerously. The fate of America hung in the balance in the weeks and months to come. We have been given access to the following archival footage, sealed from the public for over 80 years, which tells the full story of how Curtis thwarted a second American Civil War. We are obligated to tell our viewers this footage is unedited and controversial.
Chancellor.
You all right?
Count Dooku. This time we will do it together.
I was about to say that.
Get help, you're no match for him. He's a Sith Lord.
Chancellor Palpatine, Sith Lords are our speciality.
Your swords, please. We don't want to make a mess of things in front of the Chancellor.
You won't get away this time, Dooku.
I've been looking forward to this.
My powers have doubled since the last time we met, Count.
Good. Twice the pride, double the fall. Sense great fear in you, Skywalker. You have hate, you have anger, but you don't use them.
Good, Anakin, good. Kill him. Kill him now.
I shouldn't.
Do it. You did well, Anakin. He was too dangerous to be kept alive.
Yes, but he was an unarmed prisoner. I shouldn't have done that. It's not the Jedi way.
It is only natural. He cut off your arm, and you wanted revenge. It wasn't the first time, Anakin. Remember what you told me about your mother and the Sand people? Now we must leave before more security droids arrive. Anakin, there's no time. We must get off this ship before it's too late.
He seems to be all right.
Leave him, or we'll never make it.
His fate will be the same as ours.